I'm your host, and today my guest is Frans Bosch. We'll be discussing how to unlock athletic potential and how to develop a coordinated, adaptable athlete. So, whether you're a high performance coach, strength and conditioning coach, or even athletes, make sure to get your notepad out. And if you're tuning in live, feel free to send through your questions by hitting the comments section below, and I'm sure we'll find some time later on in the show. But welcome, Frans. Really looking forward to our chat, mate. Thank you for joining us early in the morning over in your world.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's early, but that's all mistakes will be down to being too early.
We've given you an excuse. um, for those, which I think there won't be too many, but for those that aren't aware of your background and your work, Frans, do you mind providing a bit of a background in how you got into the industry of performance sport, what you did prior to that, but also some consultancy jobs that you've done in elite sport as well?
Yeah, I started out as a PE teacher. Very quickly found out that I don't like it, so did that for a couple of years. Then I became an artist, a painter. Did that for 2 decades, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And found out that I didn't like the art world at all. And at the same time, I was already coaching athletes. From being an artist, I became a medical illustrator to make a living. And one day, a publisher said, "Listen, you know more about it than these clones. Why don't you write the books yourself?" So I wrote some books. From that, started teaching at University for Applied Science and Sports, anatomy, strength training, motor learning, motor control, those kind of topics. Started consulting from that with mainly in rugby. Started with rugby first, England national team, then Wales, then Japan. From there, I've done all kinds of different sports as a consultant. I wrote two other books, um, and here I am. Yeah.
Yeah. And along your way, who have been some strong influences that have sort of helped, I guess, shape your sort of philosophy, perhaps early days?
Um, yeah. Well, obviously, my main interest is what the scientific background of it is, what it is, and then the real big change in thinking actually stemmed from learning about complex systems and dynamic systems and ecological dynamics and those kind of things, which is fundamentally different from any classic approach there is. And from that, obviously, you stumble into all kinds of consequences it has for how you do how you should look at human development and movement and sports and things like that. So that would be the biggest influence or the biggest orientation that I got. And looking at it, I saw that there was hardly anything there that translated all these complex theories to anything that could be applied. So that's what I try to do in my work. I also had a very keen interest in anatomy. I remember when I was 17 or 18, when I was studying, we had anatomy classes, and they said, "Listen, this is an IT band. It's as strong as you can believe it. You can hang a truck from it, but it's only there to stabilize the knee a little bit." And I thought that cannot be right, right? If a truck can hang from it, the truck will hang from it. So
Mm.
I've always been very interested in what the consequences were from the anatomy that I saw in front of me. Yeah. And I started to combine those things. So that's probably what I did my own work.
That curiosity when you were 17, was that um, out of just pure passion and interest for movement, or was there a thinking that you were, going to help athletes perform at the highest level? What, were you a coach? Would you identify as a coach quite early on, or was it more just something you were quite
Uh,
fascinated in?
Mainly, it was a scientific kind of interest. Right, I've
Uh-huh.
been interested in anything that has to do with biology, and obviously, when I was studying anatomy, was a very important topic in there. and I've always been fascinated by how that would work and why it would be like the way it is. So
Hmm.
that would be a starting point. And I only started coaching, I think, 4 years after I graduated, 5 years after. And obviously, it took a long time before I could put that interest and that knowledge that I gradually gained into practical application. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And there was no specific sort of mentorship or apprenticeship that you had under someone during those early days
No,
of coaching necessarily. It was more just self discovery and
yeah,
experimenting and learning on the go. Yeah.
I'm pathologically self-taught. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about career highlights, Franz? Like moments that sort of spring front of mind that you're proud of over your career?
Uh, I'm not wired like that. I'm not let's say looking at success and being proud of that. I'm much more wired in a way that I see what I found very
Hmm.
interesting events, and there are positive events that are very interesting, and also very negative events that were very interesting. And I look back at what I learned from those. So just to mention, let's say one positive, uh, 2015 with Japan Rugby, Eddie Jones and John Pryor, because they put all their money on the card of good movement, and took all the consequences it has for training. Right, it was not window dressing or anything like that. It was really the core of what they wanted to do, and then see how that then plots out in such a squad, and what the effect is on how they play. That was an interesting experiment as far as I'm concerned. So that was
Yeah.
and that's one. But also negative ones, right? 2004 Olympics, uh, hardly having any access to training grounds, to what have you, medical facilities. Going to the Olympics and not having an accreditation to go on the warm up track, only being able to sit in the stadium and coach. So I had an athlete who had to do it all by himself. He was an American athlete and from the US, and the US in that respect is fairly stupid. So he sat on the 40-degree centigrade warm up track for 2 hours because they sent him to the track an hour too early. Then he
Mm.
came on the field to do his run up for. He was a high jumper for his high jump. He ran up twice, cramped both his calves, and that was the end of the Olympics. So that's where I learned that shoveling snow in the winter to beat the Russians in high jump doesn't make any sense, and that you need a lot of things in place, and a lot of assets in order to get it right. Yeah. And obviously that's something
Yeah.
that I've been looking at things like for the rest of my career as well. So, for instance, if you look at the sports team like a rugby team or an AFL team, the way they're understaffed is absolutely ridiculous, right? One or two S&C coaches for 30 or 40 players doesn't make any sense. Same you see in big money sports where they got all the money in the world, understaffed like crazy,
Mm.
ridiculous. Yeah.
Is there any, I guess with Olympic athletes, do you feel like that's closer to where it should be in pro sports, where there is a bit more of a one-on-one time when you
Uh,
work, or is that more just private consultancy work?
Yeah, well, obviously, it's. I don't think if you're doing a coaching session, you have more than 3 or 4 athletes, it becomes crowd control. There's no way around
Mm.
it.
Hmm.
So, uh, what's the point there? Yeah, that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, so about 3 to 4 is about the sweet spot for the coach to have a real impact.
Yeah, exactly, because you need to have that interaction. You need to see what's going on, and you need to be enough focused on that person in order to know whether you should step in or you should step back, whether you should
Hmm.
go to the right with what you're doing, and so on and so forth. And with big groups, you don't get that. It's nobody can do that.
Mm.
And it's
Yeah, it's an
so
interesting
encouraging
point.
team sports that we work with big groups, and and they all, well, are doing the same thing like sheep. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. Yeah,
Yeah, when there's so much variance between the athletes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you think in that, I guess, in your thinking, what's the way to change that? Is there any club that you've known where perhaps players invest in their own private coaches, like in the NBA? I know that you hear of them having their own private coaches. Is that the way forward, or is it clubs having bigger soft caps?
I think it has to start with educating players, right? I've been very disappointed with the number of players who are not studying themselves and are not studying their sport, and they're just doing what they're told, and that's it, right? And I cannot even give you a good, extensive answer on what their strong points, weak points are, where they should develop, how they should develop, what kind of properties they are good at, and what kind of components they're not good at, what they need to develop. Loads of them, and they are professional athletes. And I think that comes down to either them being very dumb, you got those as well, but also not education of those things not being a major part in what's happening when they're in academies and things like that. So what I've seen is that the best players that I've ever worked with are the ones who can give you the best overview of how they function, and what works for them and what doesn't work for them, where the strong points are, where the weak points are, what the work ons are, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
they're
I
really
think,
driving, or they're empowered to drive their development.
sorry?
The athletes should be driving their development and
Yeah, they should at least be very active in it and not be passive, just accepting what's thrown at them, right? And that obviously is something that also has another. There's another side to the coin as well, is that because we have this situation that they're exposed to a lot of coaches who just throw anything at them without trying to figure out what an individual needs, right? And that have one philosophy or one big selling point that they try to get across, and that's it. So what you also see with bit experienced players is that they become very reluctant for new influences because it's the next snake oil seller, right? That's
Mhm, mhm.
so it's. I think even team sports there should be a very strong individual component to it.
Going back to the 2015 campaign with England Rugby, Eddie Jones, JP. From the very start of you starting your work there, was there? Did you have to sort of earn your time with the athletes, and that built up over time, or were you sort of had that autonomy straight away?
Oh no, not at all. I mean, Eddie Jones had a philosophy that they had to be quicker and more agile on the field than anyone else, and they took all the consequences it needs to have for that. And JP
Mhm.
as well. I didn't need to fight for my corner at all. I was even not shocked, but quite a bit like they're really stepping into this, right? They're really
Really
taking
invested.
a gamble, if you want to really invest in this. Yeah, and at a very consequential way. Never say, okay, we do this, and we need to go to something that's a bit more safe, or what we know better, or very much step by step, taking all the consequences of the approach. That's why it was such an interesting experience. Yeah.
And during that process, or other clubs where you've consulted with the athletes, do you have to sort of measure the progress that the athletes are achieving? And if so, how do you like to do that in your line of work?
See, one of the consequences if you work with dynamic systems is that it's not easy to measure, right?
Hmm.
Uh, let's say if you say, okay, we're looking at running speed. That's one of the first thing that was what John Pryor and Eddie Jones said. This is what we look at, right? Then, if you look at it from a perspective of dynamic systems, it doesn't make any sense because pure running speed is not in a context, right? Uh, and it's not the most important thing in if you want to be fast on the field, because in a context like a rugby game or a VFL game, it's about how you can change your shape, your body shape when you're running. It's how you can go from acceleration to top speed at any given moment, not just that moment which gives you the overall fastest time. There's a lot of other things that are influential. And then if you say, okay, we just look at running speed, you're missing the point of what's really important in the game itself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very complex than what you should measure, right? And
Yeah,
the closer you want to come to the reality, the more complex your measuring tools need to be, and it becomes so complex that you cannot do it anymore, right? So you kind of need to accept in a certain way that you cannot put it in numbers.
for
That's
sure.
uh,
And
that's
and I guess
not
the product will showcase it once Eddie Jones sees the team playing after a period of time. It's that game speed. Is that the best measure at the end of the day? Is what the athletes are able to do on the field and the feedback they give on how they feel, if they feel that they've got more speed in the context of rugby, and then the
yeah.
coach's eye as well. It looks faster, and they look like more of a dominant team.
If you let's say you have somebody with running with the ball, right? Then he can have a certain speed, but if that speed is such that there's no change of direction possible
Mm-hmm.
in that body shape, then that speed doesn't say anything because the opponent knows where he will end up in 1.2 seconds from now, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you run with a little bit lower speed, but in a body shape, which we call an option position, that you can, let's say, have 5, 6 options open of whether go to the left, to the right, to kick or stop or whatever, right? Then nobody knows where you will be in 1.2 seconds from now. So it's not just that speed that is giving you a clue about how successful you can be on the field. It's linked to many other things that are very important in order to be successful. So, and how do you measure that, right? It becomes really complicated.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
can't.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. No, that's yeah, it's fascinating, and but on the flip side of from a highlights perspective, you mentioned the 2004 Olympics. What have been some other, I guess, significant challenges that you've faced over your career, and what did you learn from those challenges? How did you sort of grow?
yeah. I think I learned the most from having very frail athletes. So my athletes were injured just like that, right? They were not robust at all, not the slightest bit. So if you do one session that's wrong, then you have to pay the consequences with injuries. Where others you can throw out of a 4-story high building and they, just walk away. I've seen a lot of those in rugby, right? Extremely robust players, but I had very frail athletes, and that's where you learn the trade. And that's something, if you, let's say, look at it from a bit of a zooming out perspective, you find the best coaches in countries where there's the least talent. It's that simple. If you're a coach in the US and you get the talent throwing at you with the buckets, right, you're not becoming a good coach because anyone can coach somebody like Jonathan Edwards or, those people who cannot even do anything wrong, right? But if you have very little talent, you get
You got to
you
get it
get
right.
all the time of what you
Yeah.
do wrong, and that's where you learn your trade. So that's why, for instance, you don't see the best sprint coaches in countries where the best sprinters are. You see them where the B and C level sprinters are, because anything you do wrong, you're out of the equation. Yeah,
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, well, we'll dive into the key topic. in your line of work, you emphasize the importance of training coordination over isolated strength. Do you mind elaborating this approach, I guess, for the audience being strength and conditioning coaches that might be perhaps following the more sort of traditional model of strength training and conditioning?
Well, first you have to look at the traditional model and see what the weak point is. The weak point, actually, there's two things that are really a weak point. The first weak point that I saw that I didn't want is that it's utopian, right? Classic training. Because you find one, let's say, one approach with all the details in it that is not just plotting out what the benefits are of the training, but also plotting out what the negatives are. It's not there. They only plot out the positives, and that's utopian. Because dynamic systems body, it's such that if you want to improve one thing out of self-protection, it will decrease something else, right? Something else will go backwards. So as long as that is not the case, that they're not very diligent in plotting out what the negatives are of classic strength training, they're really missing the point. And the second thing that is, in my point of view, wrong in classic training is that they overestimate transfer of training completely. There is no transfer of training that's happening in the way they plot it out. Let's say start with the most stupid thing there is, like biomotor properties, like speed, strength. Those things are not existing. There's no such thing as strength. There's no such a thing as speed. It's all, let's say, a manifestation of something very complex, right? And then say, okay, do strength training so you become stronger, and it will automatically transfer. That's nonsense. It's just not happening. So if you look at training theory, the big problem is that anything that has to do with transfer training is not well researched or well explained, right? So for transfer of training, you need specificity, right? Are there big books on specificity? Hardly anything, right? It's just an assumption. Where if you would take it serious, then you would have really, really big textbooks on specificity. Because as when you can, let's say, analyze that in very great detail, then you know if I do something here in an S&C setting, you have a chance that it will show itself over there in the sports setting. And the whole transfer problem is seen as something magical or something that we take for granted, and that's a big problem. So what I try to do in my books is to try to give a little bit of an idea of what it could be. I mean, you have to be very modest on that because what I write down about transfer and specificity is also still in the dark ages. Let's be honest, right? Because we just don't know properly how it works. And I try to make that the centerpiece of how you should think. Yeah. That's basically the way I look at it from what I've done.
And when you're consulting with professional teams that perhaps have a bias towards the sort of traditional model, what are some of the ways that you influence early days? I guess rather than sort of changing everything at once, is it mainly the field sessions, or is it more in the gym? Is it a bit of both? Is it athletes that are injured with rehab first, and then the main group? Sort of, yeah.
Yeah, injury prevention is probably the one that is, and rehab is probably the ones which is easiest because it's a very confined thing. So and then the whole team and what happens in the gym will express itself on the field, and those are very long processes to get implemented. And first of all, a staff needs to be willing to go in that direction, and then invite you. Otherwise, you got no chance, right? If let's say a CEO of a club thinks it's a good idea and they catapult you into a staff that is not interested in it, you got no chance, right? Because the difference between that mentality and that way of thinking and the way of thinking you want to bring to the table is so big that it takes a long time before you to get there. So with where we have done this seriously now in a major league baseball team, it's a process of years and heavy investment in education of coaches and so on. Yeah.
And you mentioned something interesting before, where often we look at the positives. So a powerlifting program where they're doing your box squat, trap bar, deadlift, bench press, increasing their weights, uh, and then power with measured with watts, perhaps, and improving that. What would be some of the negative adaptations to that traditional model of strength and power training as examples that perhaps we're not seeing as coaches, or maybe athletes that are doing those practices might not be aware of the negative effects that are starting to outweigh the positive benefits of that type of training?
Yeah, well, one of the most interesting things that we came across is when we wrote an article on rate of force development, right? So I wrote it together with Bas van Horen. He did all the dirty work. I take all the credits, as it usually is, but he's done a lot of good work there. And if you look at what's out there in classic strength training literature, right, it says that high resistance ballistic training is very good for rate of force development, right? Now, what I said to Bas said, listen, you have to look to all the articles you can find on rate of force development and training, right? And what you have to look at is what resistance did they use to measure rate of force development against. So I think he went through 270 articles, and there was only one that mentioned what resistance they use. And what they typically use is the highest possible resistance you can find, like a mid-thigh pull or something, right? And then there's this assumption that rate of force development against a very high resistance tells you something about rate of force development against a very low resistance or no resistance at all. Or like the second step in acceleration, then the resistance from the ground is fairly low because it's going underneath you already very quickly, right? Accelerating a tennis racket is also very low resistance. And there is no connection between rate of force developments against a very high resistance, a very low resistance. So there's a lot of assumptions there about being positives from high resistance training that are not based on anything. Actually, there's a good reason to assume that if you do a lot of heavy resistance training, that it's very bad for rate of force development against a low resistance. Because if you have a very high resistance and you're doing that quite a bit, right, then or eliminated the problem of slack in muscles automatically because of the resistance. And then the body thinks, oh, I can have more slack. And if you have more slack, your rate of force development against a low resistance goes backwards. So that's one of the utopian approaches that I've seen that are maybe fairly technical, but that are absolutely there. And that's something else you can see in athletics these days, right? There's way less strength training in athletics than it was 10, 15 years ago. Way less. Yeah.
Yeah. And more explosive plyometrics and speed, or focus on those two qualities.
Yeah.
Acceleration.
Body tension and good rate of force development without having big resistance. Yeah. I also see it in they're much less muscular than they were and all those things. Yeah. So that's one, as far as I'm concerned, one key example of where classic strength training got it completely wrong, right? Because they're basically thinking utopian that training only has positive effects, but every training you do also has a negative effect, and you have to weigh the positive and the negative in such a way that you end up with something positive. Yeah, if you add it up.
And I know it's hard without having context, but does the let's say you've got an Olympic level sprinter that's preparing for gold medal, they're in the peak shape of their life. does their does the training for them for a 100-meter sprinter look more specific than I guess a 15-year-old that's still developing a lot of physical attributes? So would you do more general strength training, power training, sprinting, accelerations, I guess coordination work, like a little bit of everything with the 15-year-old, whereas with the specialist, would you have more of a specialist approach because the strength training might take away from their speed and acceleration at the higher level, where at a low level they're going to get some benefits
Yeah,
from everything?
yeah, that's another thing which I found to be very utopian in classic training, right? If you look at all the research that's done, it's never been done with elite athletes because
Mm.
they don't donate their body for something like that, right?
Yeah, for
It's
sure.
always recreational athletes. With the recreational athletes, you can do anything, and everything works.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
tell a 15-year-old that he shouldn't eat McDonald's junk food 3 times a week, he'll be faster as well, right?
Yeah.
So anything works at that age. Uh, and then do you want to have short time gains, right? Or do you want a development that will be beneficial when he's in his 20s? And I'm convinced that if you want to have the development in his 20s prioritized, that at a young age you also should do a very integrated approach where you don't separate coordination from force production, right? And then you get much more of a balanced development of an athlete. Yeah, I mean you can take that very short sprint to early success at 17, 18-year old, but then you pay the price when they are 20, 24 years old, and
Yep.
the development stops too early. Yeah. So I don't see much difference there, and also because from a motor control point of view, we know that the output that you eventually can give is very much depending on the amount of variability that you can handle, right?
Mhm.
Uh, let's say if the environment is variable and it's not disturbing you in such a way that you lose control of your movement pattern and the endpoints you want to reach, then the output will be eventually bigger than when you're very frail in that respect and you cannot handle any variability.
Mhm.
So the motor control part always is a very, very important part, not just with developing athletes, but also the elite athletes. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, does it get more important the more elite someone is, or does it just, it's always sort of the
Sorry?
same? Does it get more important as athletes get to the pointy end of their sport, and they're looking at, yeah, like you said, they've developed. You're not thinking long term; you're more thinking short term. Does the motor control aspect of their training and making sure that everything you're doing is specific to their results of what they want to achieve become more important, or does it sort of
Um,
stay? Does that philosophy stay the same
yeah, I
throughout
would
the
say the
process?
integration of things and how things influence each other is always very important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you one example of which is an anecdotal example, right? I think it was in uh, 1999. I was sitting outside at the World Championships athletics in Seville. Yeah, and I was chatting with a Dutch marathon runner, and he was quite good. He ran 2:08 or something, right, which is quite good. And he said to me, "Well, something that I always do when I want to become in top shape is, and I don't know why it works, but it works. I go to Kenya, and there's this path of about a kilometer long, and everything in that path is tilted and crooked. So there's not one step that is the same. So and I just run up and down that path, and automatically I get into top shape, which basically means that if you're closer to a competition, you should not avoid variability, but you actually should embrace variability because that variability will make your technique more robust, and that more robust technique you can express in deepening your attractors or whatever you are, if you're going to dynamic systems, and that will mean that if you're more robust in your attractors, the body is willing to go to a more extreme output. So
Mhm.
it's the variability, and the role of variability is and robustness that is combined with variability is a very, very important factor that always has to be, let's say, a tool that you use.
Couple of questions from those tuning in live. Peter Hope's written in, interested if Frans would agree that the emphasis on athletes attaining maximal strength training in traditional gym setting is overemphasized.
Yes, and that depends a little bit on what sport you do, right? If you're on the scrum, it's obviously a little bit different from you being a long jumper. But let's say if it's a sport that's very close to what we see in athletics, strong enough. That's the whole thing. You need to be strong enough, because the only function that maximum strength training has is recruiting enough muscle fibers for the elastic components to do the work properly, and that's
Mm-hmm.
it. What basically means that if you look at what athletes are doing these days, so how that shifted is that they just do one session of 45 minutes a week, in which some heavier maximum strength training is done. Once they're at that level, and they don't even try to push it, because if you push it, the negatives will outweigh the positives. And then the emphasis is much more on using that recruitment by pre-tension and good technique on the track, in order to use your elasticity properly. So I would say it's
Interesting.
very quickly over emphasized. Yeah. So the
And
concept of strong.
then, what would they be doing? What would be how many other sessions would they be doing, and what are they focusing on in that
So
week?
what I did, and but also a coach that I really admire did. Eventually, it's you do two strength sessions a week, one
Uh-huh.
with heavier, let's say, recruitment kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
not very ambitious, and one is based on what I call reflex training. So you use pathways that are enhanced by big reflexes, like cross extensor reflex and things like that, and that are very much geared to neuromuscular fatigue. And both are 45 minutes, and both are not overly ambitious. Yeah, and then the rest of the time is done on the track.
Right. Yeah, cool. And that's with the skills coaches and tactical coaches, or physical development with um, a more someone who's focused on their athletic movement, running mechanics,
Yeah,
and
running
skill
mechanics.
movement.
Yeah. So there's just let's say if you stay at track and field, right? And let's say you have a high jump, right? Then you're very much look at how much time you need to recover from stuff, right? And then the main guideline is passive tissue. That is the big one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how many jumps that somebody can do? Let's say my Olympic high jumpers, right? So they can do jumps from a run up in a safe way between 7 and 10 a week. So there's one session with 7 jumps or 10 jumps, depends a little bit on the individual, and then you back off. Right. Then you can do about so these boundings, right, over hurdles or something like that. You can do 30 or 40 in a week. So that's one session of if you take 6 hurdles of let's say 8 repetitions. That's it. Right.
And was that part of the reflex strength 45-minute session, or that's separate?
No, that's separate, right?
Yep.
So you have one maximum strength training, one reflex in the gym,
Mm-hmm.
one jumps over hurdles, one from a run up high jump, and then we did one session with sprinting, and one what I call the off grid, all kinds of things that have nothing to do with high jump, and that's it. And that would
That's where
be
the
if you would,
variability comes in on that
yeah,
off. What
yeah,
was that last session called?
we put the variability in everywhere, but that's yeah, just as a to back off even more. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that
And
would
what
be that would be the limit of what you could do.
What would be sort of examples of exercises for the reflex strength session in the weights room?
Uh, that would be varying from single leg cleans or to balance and then jump on a box or those kind of things.
Okay.
So actually, where you mimic the patterns of running and jumping in a gym session. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and you do it in such a way with weight that is so low that you can do 5 or 6 reps, and then after 5 or 6 reps, you have this spike of fatigue. That's typically neuromuscular, and
Mm-hmm.
then you recover quickly from that neuromuscular fatigue, and then you can do your second. If you have something where the fatigue goes up very gradual during the repetitions, then it's not neuromuscular. Then you're actually taxing the muscles itself, the fibers. Yeah.
And Shane Leanne's written in a question as well for you, Frans. Do you think traditional strength training negatively influences peripheral motor control?
Um, yes, it does. Because one thing you don't need in traditional strength training is co-contractions, right? Because it's the muscle against the resistance, and that is where the equilibrium comes from. Where if you look in explosive sports, the peripheral motor control is based on properties of muscles, but they need to be activated, and that can only be activated by co-contractions prior to the moment they have to correct things. So if I run, I have typically swing leg retraction. In that swing leg retraction, I build up the tension in all the muscles, and then when the ground hits the foot, then these muscles can correct errors, and that's peripheral control. So if you're running in that direction to the right in strength training with resistance, where you actually need to be to the left, co-contractions, then obviously it can have a negative effect. And that depends a lot on the individual again, because there are people who are not very sensitive to it. They can do a lot of strength training and then have co-contractions as well. But I also know of one sprinter who's a national champion. If he would do one heavy strength training session, his whole season was ruined. Everything fell apart, and everything
And
can be individual.
what could you notice? Is that the shapes? Is it his running form? How he feels? Like, what were the things that you could see where that strength session was having a negative effect?
So how he would fall apart,
Oh,
losing
injuries,
no losing 3 or 4 tenths of a second in a 100 meter race.
his
Yeah, so,
performance.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I've seen the same thing with another kid who actually was a world junior record holder in 100 meters, right? Ran 10 seconds when he was a junior, then started
Mm.
doing heavy resistance training, then uh, couldn't run faster than 10.6 or something like that. Then he was advised to back off and start doing more technical coordination based training, went back to 10.10, but then he decided to do heavy resistance training, went back to 10.60. Those things happen, right? And it's not happening with everyone. There's people who are robust and stay within that same, let's say, performance window, but there's quite a few people who are very sensitive to this.
Hmm.
And that's where visualization plays a role, right? Because the
Hmm.
positive and negatives are not depending on the exercise, but are depending on the characteristics of the individual.
And you mentioned something earlier before about traditional strength training. Was it increase the slack of the muscles? Is that right? Do you
Yeah,
mind elaborating what that
yeah,
means and why is that a negative thing for athletic performance, increasing slack?
yeah. Well, everybody has slack. That means that your muscles are not lined up and ready to apply force on the attachment points, right? It's like you can't see it now here, but if you would look at my muscles, they're hanging like loose ropes, right?
Uh huh. Uh
And
huh.
for they apply force on the attachment points, they need to be shortened, right? And that's called slack. You have to take out the slack of the muscles. Now, basically, what you do is that if you're in explosive sports, you don't have time for that, right? Because your stance
Three
phase and
tenths.
running 1/10 of a second, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
have to prepare and you prepare that by co-contracting muscles before they have to apply force. So they are at a higher level of tension at the moment they have to apply big forces on the attachment points. Now, that is done by very complicated and complex coordination of co-contractions. You shouldn't have too many. You shouldn't have them at the wrong moment. You should have the right amount at the right moment. So complex coordination. If you do heavy resistance training, that doesn't play a role. You don't need it. And the body is such that if you say, okay, if over here you want me to apply big forces against heavy resistance, the price you pay is that I have less co-contractions and more slack in other situations because the
Because you
body
can't have
doesn't.
both.
Yeah, it wants to be conservative, right? It wants to,
Right.
uh, and that's why if you do a lot of heavy resistance training and you're very sensitive to it, your slack could increase quite a bit, and then in all explosive sports you go backwards.
Interesting.
So that's the complexity of that you have to embrace as a coach if you want to work with dynamic systems. One of the key aspects of it.
Yeah. And when you're working in a sport like rugby where it is combative, how do you find that fine balance between, I guess, for the athletes that do need strength training from a body composition point of view, like they need that critical mass, that body armor, but then you're also
Yeah.
trying to, like Eddie Jones's team, you're trying to make them
Yeah.
fast as well.
So I try to emphasize all the time that if you're in rugby and you want to have more body mass, it should just be in your upper body. It should never
Right.
be in your lower. And I try to get a
So then,
point
yeah.
across when I showed that the under 20s had bigger legs than the national team, right? So you should never ever do any hypertrophy training for your lower body because it's detrimental for your running. Just as a thrower should be very careful with anything that's hypertrophy training for the upper body because it's very bad for your throwing. So that's what I try to emphasize, right? If you need more body mass, make sure it's around your shoulders to protect yourself for injury. And the second thing I try to get across is that you should eliminate all counter movements in all exercises. Don't allow any counter movements because the counter movement is a way to take out slack, right? And if you take out slack by making a counter movement, you lose time, and you cannot afford to lose time on the field. You have to do it from co-contractions. So that's basically the two first steps that you take. Yeah, and then you have to convince people that that is the way forward. Yeah. And also something I noticed, for instance, with a team I worked with, there were 5 or 6 players who could not do any heavy resistance training because heavy resistance training already ruined their back, right? And they had to do other training, like jump training, and they were just as strong in their legs as when they do heavy resistance training. So you hardly need it. Running,
Yeah, makes
jumping.
sense.
But also, like Rybakov, former world champion, double world champion, high jump, never touched a weight in his life. He was afraid he would become heavier. Still became world champion twice. So it's not a thing that you
is necessary.
that you need without any restrictions, right? There's a lot of way around it, and again, weigh the negatives and the positives.
Yeah. And can you explain the difference between attractors and fluctuators? I know that's something that you've mentioned before, and perhaps in the context of Australian rules football, if possible, or a field-based sport, team-based, field-based sport.
Yeah, let's talk about AFL a little bit. So if you take AFL, right, it's mayhem. It's basically 2 packs of dogs try to rip each other apart, right, without much structure in it, almost. So if you have that, then you have a very complex environment, right? And if you look at the body, it's also very complex. We have a very complex body and a very complex environment. If you combine those two, you're not capable of controlling it anymore. It's too complicated, right? So there's one thing you can do is make your body simpler, right? So where you have 150 joints that can move in all directions, make sure 140 are joints that you don't need to control. And you do that by co-contracting. So a joint gets into its sweet spot and stays there because all the muscles are interacting with each other, and you find that sweet spot where your joint is strongest, right? And those are almost self-stabilizing components of movement. And those self-stabilizing components of movement are called attractors. And that means that you don't need to control them, otherwise then just sending a big signal for stability, right? And that you interact with the environment with only very few components. Those are the fluctuations that then are, let's say, controlled for good interaction with the complex environment. So the body itself has to be made simpler, right, with less components, less moving parts, so to speak. And so there are only very few left for interacting with the environment. A sport where you can see that in a rather straightforward way is in baseball. If you're a batsman in baseball, right, then you could use all these joints to adapt to the flight path of the ball, the height and the velocity inside out. But what we found is that you only use 3 joints for that. And all the other joints are not interested in where the ball is at all. If you look at good tennis players, the way they hit the ball, the whole action of the arm is actually not interested in where the ball is at all. That's done by the trunk, leaning forward, backwards, sideways. So the arm is an attractor, the trunk is a fluctuation. And what you need in AFL, where you have all this mayhem, is that you're very good at using the attractors to make the body simpler. So you get fluctuations that are perfect for interacting with the environment.
Makes
And that
sense.
means you're very good at building these attractors and very good at applying these attractors.
So all the more reason to have, I guess, control of your own body in a
Yeah,
chaotic
yeah,
environment. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I think Harry Simonton sent through a good question on that. Given that AFL players are generally well adapted to fatigue by the nature of the sport, it's a very long game. I think it's the longest team sport game in the world. What stimulus do you think they are lacking exposure to, and how would this influence your approach to training an AFL player?
Well, I think what they lack exposure to, at least that's what I experienced. When the number of times that I've been looking at AFL or been involved with AFL, first of all, and that's something very Australian, and also maybe a little bit worrying, no integration of departments, right? It's completely, everybody's in his own corner, fighting his own corner. So you see exercise physiologists working on the stamina of players, and with the things they do, put them on a bike or something, completely ruin their running technique. And then you see each department doing its own thing. So first of all, the integration should be there. And that's actually a complaint I heard a lot from people in Australia working at the Australian Institute of Sport, but also in AFL and NRL, is we become better at our own specialized expertise, but we becoming worse at integrating things. And then coordination should be something that is a very important factor for AFL players, because that's the only way you can protect your body against that mayhem. So, for instance, you have your running cycle, right? And in that running cycle, there are attractors. And these attractors, by nature, because that's what the evolution of a million years has done, are protective for the body, right? So if you run into a situation where there is mayhem, competing for a ball, jumping, running to a jump, and then landing and catching the ball and running on, then you need to have that protective mechanism switched on, right? And then that very simply means that if you're an AFL player, when you run into to the action, your step frequency always needs to go up, because then the protective mechanism works better. Each time you see somebody get injured, an ACL injury or whatever, right, in the steps before, you see the step frequency go down. So that would be something in education for AFL players that needs to be in place, right? And there's more. It's just one example of what at this moment I think still is just, if you're very talented and very lucky, you do that automatically, but it's not been part of the teaching of AFL players. So you can have stamina till you're blue in the face, right? But you get injured if you cannot protect yourself. And for instance, with ACL, the idea that people get an ACL because they're not strong enough is nonsense. Because I've seen the strongest people I've ever seen on the rugby field get an ACL, like they were strong as an ox, but they just switched off the self-protection mechanism. Yeah.
And those benefits of coordination and increasing stride frequency, I imagine, not only help mitigate injuries, but also help with performance. So being more agile on the field and move more efficiently. Yeah.
Those are the same thing. Would be very strange if evolution has gone in a way that what protects you against injury is bad for performance. That would be a weird species, right?
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
and so yeah.
Leanne also sent through another question: the balance between developing motor control and the role of failure in learning. I guess if we keep it with AFL athletes, if that works, or
so the main thing is that if we want to improve coordination, we don't want to have garbage in our library, right? You don't want a library where there's a huge amount of books there and you cannot find any copy anymore, right? So what we want in our, let's say, library, if you want to talk about it, name it like that, of movements, is that we want to have as little in there that is as efficient as possible and that can be applied in as many situations, right? So with the less content and be able to do more with it, the better it is. So how do you avoid the garbage in your library? That is done by things that are kind of a paradox. For instance, one paradox is that you need to be specific. So you have to prove that something is connected with something else, but you also need to prove the opposite, that it can be used everywhere. That's the overload principle. There's another principle: you need to be successful enough for the body to prove that it can be valuable, but also you need to trigger a learning process, a kind of a panic reaction. And that means that you need to be not successful, right? So you need to be successful and you need to be not successful. And then the question is, how much success do you need and how much failure do you need? And there's a fair, good, let's say, consensus about that. It's at about 60% of the time, 70% of the time, being successful is the sweet spot for learning. So you need failure to trigger it. You need success for it to be seen as valuable for the system. 70% success probably is the sweet spot.
so when you're running a session with an athlete and you're just basically the drills that you're doing and the themes of your sessions, you just try to stick to that principle in terms of out of 10 reps of a exercise. If they do all 10 very well, and you're seeing the attractors done at a high level, the next set you would vary that movement, make it more challenging for them for a bit of failure until they then succeed that movement, and then you go through that process.
Yeah, it's your guideline for making it more difficult.
And is there a level where a movement is redundant, or do you just sort of completely change the drill once you've progressed the variability as much as you can Do you then move
Uh,
on to just a whole different task, or?
Now, what actually is see, what we've been talking about now so far is movement as something very isolated, right? But movement has actually another specific property. So first of all, it gets you from A to B, but then also movement influences the information you get. So the sensory information that comes in, right? If
Mhm.
I'm standing still on the field and people are running around, then I see things changing all the time, right? Let's say I have an opponent who's running around me. I see him change the position all the time. But if I start moving with him, he stays in the same spot relative to me, right? That's what movement also does. So movement has that very important task of shaping the information and making the information simple. So it's not just that sensory information leads to movement, movement also leads to sensory information. And that's what Rob Gray always is emphasizing, right? Sensory motor coupling, right? Keep them coupled. So what you then do if somebody is good at the motor part, right, is make sure that it also that second task of making the sensory information simpler is playing a role. And that means you make it more context related. You make it much more context related. And that leads to a next step, right? Decision making. Because decision making very often is seen as something very cognitive, but a very important part of decision making, and that's something that AFL coaches need to understand, is this coupling of movement and sensory information. Because especially in AFL rugby, a lot of decisions are made by just making information simpler and not by having a tactical concept in their head. So you can then bridge the gap from what you do with movement, right? What movement is good movement, up to the point where it has a very big influence on decision making. That's why you don't see any good decision makers who can't move properly. Right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And Dean Benton sent through a few questions. One, why do you think ACLs are so prevalent these days in field and court sports like your AFL soccer, NFL?
I think so. If you're interested in female soccer, it's been now a big issue, right? A lot of discussion
Hmm.
about it, and they gave all kinds of reasons, and one of the reasons is also coordination. But if you look at after we've been looking at all virtually all non-contact ACL injuries, and they're all the same. It's always the same movement pattern that goes wrong. So what you have if you're on the field, you have phase transitions, one organization principle, and then you jump to another organization principle. That could be acceleration to deceleration, could be acceleration to a sidestep, and so on. Right? And if people are not capable of making very clean transitions from one organization principle to the next organization principle, they end up in a position where self-protection is not possible. And that's where the ACLs happens. So now if you look at what's happening in a lot of field sports, is that we have got the sheer athleticism up, the sheer stamina up. They're much stronger than maybe they were 10 years ago, but the coordination part of self-protection is nowhere at all because nobody looks at it. And the ideas that are out there on that self-protection usually are completely wrong as well. So the reason is this that everything has become more intense, and the self-protection is not been taught into athletes properly. Yeah.
And the flexibility side of things, that was something that Dean DB also commented on in terms of why do you think flexibility is so undeservedly got a bad name, and it's something I've probably noticed as well. There's not necessarily a lot of time dedicated to increasing flexibility in elite sport. Why do you think that is, and do you think it has a side effect on any athletic qualities like elastic bounding, for example?
Yeah. First of all, flexibility is an absolute key to self-protection. because if you're not flexible, it doesn't mean that all the structures are equally short and stiff, right? Some will be stiffer, another will be longer. That means that self-protection is not possible because you cannot build the interaction between the components properly. So flexibility is an absolute key to self-protection. Let's say I worked with Welsh rugby, and there was one player, Elwyn Jones, who is the most capped player in history, international history. He was very flexible, and he was very, very precise in making sure his flexibility was good. Right. So it's for self-protection and health. It's absolutely necessary, and it's underrated everywhere. I mean, each and every AFL player should be flexible, or try to get as flexible as he can. And then it has no negative effect on performance. To put it very simple, if that would be the case, there would be no gymnasts, right? They're flexible as
Hmm.
hell, and they can bounce and be elastic, like unbelievable. I had two high jumpers, one who was stiff as a doornail, and the other was also did martial arts, so you could kick high kicks and everything, and do splits and whatever you want. And they both jumped higher than 230. So there's no connection whatsoever between flexibility and how well you can use your elastic properties. That's a myth. So I would always make it a very important part of my program for self-protection.
And for the athletes listening in, what's your favorite way to improve either hamstring flexibility, I guess thoracic spine, uh, where else would be groins, like the sort of those big, and ankles, I guess, like the big joints. What's your favorite way to improve
Uh,
flexibility in those areas?
well, there's actually just one simple rule. Flexibility is a skill, right? So passive stretching doesn't make any sense that somebody is stretching you. You have to do it as a skill. And then as soon as you're, let's say, know what the skill is, then you put it under pressure by making it less stable. So you have to be keeping your balance while you're doing the stretching. And then anything goes. I'm not interested in whether you're do static or dynamic stretching, because it's a skill. All of these things are important, right? So you have to approach it as a skill.
Mm, okay, interesting. So yeah, keeping your balance, and then that this is an element of, I guess, you're not just switching off and you're mentally engaged with the task when you're doing flexibility training, as if just like when you're doing a coordinative complex movement.
Uh, Sorry, I missed that one.
With I guess like when athletes typically do passive stretching, it you're not if you just lie on your back, you might be stretching your hamstring, talking to a friend. You're not too in tune with the task because it's quite simple. If there's balance involved, do you feel like it's something that it should be a challenging task that the athlete needs to focus on the activity?
Basically, you see, that's how we do hamstring stretching. If you stretch a muscle that's not active, the line of stretch always go to the same pathway, right? And it can be very easy the case that you're having this pathway, but that the spot that is tight is over there.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't make much sense. So what you should do, and that's a little bit PNF kind of stuff, is that you're
Mm-hmm.
stretching while the muscle is active, right? So once we do it with a hanging TRX or a noose, and then you put your foot in there, and you're on one knee in a kind of a lunge with the foot in there, and then you manipulate the position of your pelvis and whether your knee is flexed or extended. You can find any spot in your hamstring, and your hamstring needs to be active, otherwise you can't be in that position. And then you start to play around that spot. And I implemented that with a few rugby teams, and it took them 4 minutes. And after 4 minutes, I said, "Okay, you can go. We know exactly what we need to do, because we feel exactly where the pain or the stretching pain or whatever we feel in stretching becomes very sharp, and that's where we need to be because it's a tight spot." So, stretching active muscles right, is probably the best way to do it. And then you're very much into the realm of coordination. Right? How can you keep the muscle activated and make sure you don't fall over while you're finding that spot which is tight, and then stretch around that spot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And one other question from Dean: can you explain potentially the side effects of elastic bounding and increasing flexibility?
Yeah, because if you're not doing anything that has to do with high impacts, right? Your passive tissue, fascias, maybe even tendon muscle junctions, they get wrinkled up, kind of like dried out spaghetti, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if you want to make that longer, you have to comb it, right? You have to pull on it, and then it all gets lined up again. And that's actually what's happening if you're doing elastic bounding, but it also is happening if you're, let's say, do a warm up, right? So you go to the field and you start running, and the first 200 meters you feel stiff, and then everything loosens up. That's a phenomenon everybody knows. It's just a passive tissue that gets aligned in the direction it needs to be. So spaghetti getting nice and straight again. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There you go. Well, thank you, Frans. I really appreciate you coming on the show and providing such detail in
Yeah.
some of your philosophies and your. I know Turan and Harry are running the practical component of your course in Australia at the end of the year, and you're running the online component. For those that aren't aware and have been fascinated by this podcast and want to find out more information, do you mind shedding a bit of light on the exciting course that's coming to Australia later in the year?
Yeah, well, it's quite an extensive course. We aim always for a very high quality. People are advised to study the books in advance, otherwise it will be high speed over their head.
Mm-hmm.
We have 3 modules of, I think, 5 hours explaining videos online each, and that's for 2 weeks. And then after one module, there's a Q&A where we make bespoke presentations on the questions people have of that module. So then the second module is again 2 weeks, and then the third module 3 weeks, 2 weeks again. And then when that is all done, people move to Melbourne, and we'll have a 2-day practical where all the theory is shown in practice by Teun Thomassen and Harry. And I think that if you have that whole volume of the 3 modules theory and the 2 days practical, and you study the book, that you can make quite a quantum leap into understanding this stuff much better. Yeah, and it's the second year running now. Last year was successful. We're doing it again this year, Victoria University. So yeah, if you want to dive into this field, and it's complicated, so you should not be having to dig through incoherent articles like I have done for years. Get a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of an overview, and then it's much easier to find your own way after the course into this. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, and I've caught up with Harry for coffee and had a great in-depth chat about his experiences in your line of work, and yeah, I can really attest to the course. I've heard of Turan's work as well, and clearly after speaking to yourself, Frans, after the last hour and 15, it'd be an invaluable experience for anyone that's interested. So we'll add the link in the show notes so people can access more information there. And I guess a little bit more on Turan. So, how long has he been involved in your line of work with the workshops, and what's his
Yeah.
background?
Yeah. I knew him for 15 years now. So he was one of my students in university. And when he has to do his internship, I could send him over to the NSwiss in Sydney. So he's done his internship there, and together with JP as well. He's been working for the National Olympic Committee as an S&C coach for women's volleyball and a lot of other sports as well. We brought him over to Japan with Japan Rugby in 2015 as well. So he was part of that experience as well. and he has been doing courses together with me now for 8 9 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And he's excellent. He's really smart. Really takes it very serious. Works very hard on it, and he does all the practicals because an old fart like me shouldn't do practicals anymore, right? So that's the way. Actually, we cooperate, and around that we got a couple of other people as well, like Lee Egger, who does a ACL course together with Teun, and that's how we build a small group of high level people who can be assisting in these courses. Yeah. So the Teun is off to Brazil now for a course over there. And we try to improve it all the time, what we're doing. Yeah.
And I've got access to the app, which has got some great exercises and
Yeah.
drills that some good visuals. How long has that been live for now, and how can people access the app?
Yeah, well, the app is, let's say, what actually we do in our exercise is a kind of a building block approach. We work
Mm-hmm.
with the localized attractors and bring them together into bigger units as bigger attractors and bigger, and that's how the app is built. And then you got all the exercises from very local to global attractors. So eventually you have exercises for deceleration, for instance, as a preparation for what you do in the field and so on. The app is now out for second year now. Yeah, they're building extensions to it, so you have the app, and then you could, let's say, select exercises and send them to your athlete. That's the next step that
Oh
will be
wow!
coming. Yeah, it will also be in multiple languages. I don't know exactly what's happening. It's Teun's lost child, so to speak. And you can access it if you go to the FBS website. There's one button in the top that says app, and that's where you can find all the details of it. Yeah. So each exercise is demonstrated in a video, and it has an explanation of what the basic meaning is of the exercise and coaching cues, how you should coach it, and yeah, that's how you can work with it.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's very easy to use, and the
Yeah.
detail is, like you said, a really high level. So, yeah, highly recommend it. Last two questions for me, Frans. We've talked about lots of things in terms of what you've done over your time, including your 3 books and the workshops, building out your business, and consulting in elite teams. What's got you most excited for the rest of 2023? What's sort of on the horizon for you at the moment? What are you passionate about?
Uh, well, I still work in Major League Baseball. Uh, what I like over there is how they really took it all in, and the success is also very good. So I want to continue with that if possible. For the rest, I'm going back to a little bit more to my previous occupation and be painting again. So
Mhm.
as a yeah, a retired worker, and for the rest, I keep working together with Tone because I like that a lot. And what we want to do actually is develop the content further and further and further. Yeah.
Very good. And pet peeves in the industry of high performance sport? Anything that fires you up, makes you
Sorry.
angry? Pet peeves, things that
Uh, yeah. Well, I put it this way: it's what a Dutch comedian slash singer once said. I like human beings, but I hate humanity.
that's
it's
great.
I mean, that's why in sports everywhere, right? When you work with individual people, then that's very often it's wonderful. But as soon as it becomes an organization and all the politics around it, it becomes annoying. Yeah,
Mm. Yeah, it makes it complicated, that's for sure. Yeah, I like
yeah,
that one.
yeah.
Well, very good. Yeah, thoroughly appreciate your time
Thank you.
jumping on the show, and It has been a few years, like we mentioned off the air, of you doing a podcast. So I really appreciate Harry hooking this up for us. Definitely a highlight of all the guests I've had on so far. This has been a really exciting one. So I really appreciate sharing your work. And for anyone that's interested, like I mentioned, we'll add links to the workshop that's happening later in Australia. If you tuned in to this live halfway through or just at the end, you can watch this on our YouTube channel. Just search for Frans Bosch Prepare Like a Pro or The Coordinated Athlete by Frans Bosch, and that will pop up. And we'll release this on our podcast in the next 2 weeks. So you can find it on Spotify and iTunes. So thank you for everyone that's tuned in. Thank you for the questions from Shane and Peter and Dean Benton as well. And our next live chat is with Jeremy Hickmans and Blake Duncan, who are working in the NRL and the Dolphins. That's 4:30 p.m. 7th of September. So I look forward to seeing you guys then. Thanks again, Frans. For anyone that wants to connect with you, where's the best place in terms of socials?
To the website, probably. Yeah.
Website, yeah. We'll add the website link in the show notes. Yeah. Thanks again.
Thank you.